Okay, so this is the first in a series of alumni-sponsored talks, and the point of this is kind of to aggregate all of the extra learning that we've been doing after Code Academy. And I know a lot of you are current students, a lot of you are alumni, so just everybody's welcome. Thank you for coming. It's kind of an experiment, so bear with us as I screw things up. But yeah, basically this talk is about the many different kinds of Ruby that are available. And that was actually mind-boggling to me when I first encountered that concept. And I encountered that concept in looking up a sort of database, which is a graph database, and they said, you really need to be using JRuby. And I was like, what is JRuby? After looking into it a little bit, I found out that the J in JRuby stands for Java. So that was how I got introduced to the idea of different kinds of Ruby. But why? Why are there different kinds of Ruby? It didn't make any sense to me. All it was is a language where you put in commands and it gives you some sort of output, right? To answer why, I think we need to explain a little bit about how. So this man is Yukiro Matsumoto-san, or as Rubyists like to call him, Mats. And he is the inventor of Ruby. His Ruby program, the original version of Ruby, was written in C. And that may be confusing as well, to have one programming language written in another. But you have to remember that Ruby scripts, Ruby programs, are basically just text files. And then a program actually has to go through that text file and decide what it means for the computer. And the original interpreter was written in C. Now there are lots and lots of different implementations, lots of different interpreters, a few of them being Rubinius, which is written in Ruby, if you'll believe it, JRuby, which is written in Java, and MacRuby, which is written in Cocoa and Objective-C. And there are lots more. There's like Ruby.NET, IronRuby, there's like, they seem to pop up every time somebody discovers that they want to write in a different language. So now we can kind of get to why you would want to write a Ruby implementation in a different language. And the reason is, the most useful reason is to have speed and integration with a native language like Java. And what I mean by this is that there are plenty of libraries in other languages that add functionality, just like a gem. In fact, the word gem is actually a Ruby name for a library. So these libraries give you a bunch of added functionality that's not necessarily written for Ruby programs. So for instance, having JRuby would give me access to Java libraries at a very fast native level. You can also write an interpreter just in order to learn the language really well, because if you can write the rules that make up the language, you know that language inside and out. And if you know it inside and out, you can extend it however you like. Of course, you might be straying off spec, or in fact, if you want to add to the new version of Ruby, you could extend it and then submit a request to try to add that into the next Ruby version. And finally, you might just love Ruby a lot, or somebody might have just told you which that probably never happens. So what does this mean for us as Rubyists, right? Well, like I said, you get access to a library, a bunch of libraries at native languages, but you also get access to the tools that have been developed for those platforms. For instance, this is a picture of Java's visual virtual machine. And what it does is it profiles the programs that are running in the Java virtual machine. And it actually tells you how much memory your program is taking up and how many threads it's taking up. And it gives you kind of an indication of like when your program is taking up too much memory, or it really helps you troubleshoot. So this is just one of the examples. I bet there's a whole bunch of other stuff that I just don't know about, but this is the one I know for sure. And besides, it's got pretty graphics. I can say that. Okay, and it also gives us the ability to develop for platforms that aren't necessarily Ruby friendly. For instance, Ruby Motion, you may have heard of it, is a way to write iOS apps completely in Ruby. And Ruby Motion is actually a port of Mac Ruby, which, like I said, is written in Objective-C and Cocoa, I believe. Not sure what that is actually. But it lets you take your existing Ruby knowledge and, without many hiccups, transfer it entirely to different platforms like iOS devices, like Mac. And then the thing that started all of this for me was Neo4j, which is a graph database written in Java. And it's just really, really cool technology. So these are just a few of the examples. I'm sure there are way more benefits to why you would want to write an interpreter in Ruby. But these are the ones that I know. I just wanted to bring up Rubinius. I just wanted to highlight it because Rubinius made no sense to me at first. Rubinius is a Ruby interpreter written completely in Ruby, which blew my mind. I had no idea for the longest time why anybody would ever want to do this. As it turns out, I think its most honest explanation is found on its website. It literally is a labor of love. They just really love the language. But after developing it, there are a lot of benefits, like if you want to understand intimately how the Ruby language works, you don't have to learn C in order to delve into Ruby's behavior. You can just hop into Rubinius and poke around. And the other thing is, if, like I mentioned before, if you want to extend Ruby, say if you're using a certain version and it's missing a feature, and you know how to do that, you can just hop into Rubinius, add that feature in a language you already understand, and then pop it back in and use it. So Rubinius is actually quite cool. Use Ruby. And that's really all I have for you. The second part is kind of like a workshop. If anybody wants to stick around and actually install one of these Ruby variants, I'll be around for a few minutes. But do you have any questions?
What are the communities around those type of platforms? And is it really kind of just kind of activist, or is there particular verticals or places in industry where one of these is gaining traction over, Max Ruby?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. So the communities are typically very small and very specialized. They tend to be centered around the developers developing these kinds of Rubies, but they tend to be developing them for very specific purposes. So in those niches, it's very valued. one exception, I think, and is JRuby. It's starting to gain prominence because it started out as being much slower than Matz's Ruby, and it has, due to the maturity of the Java virtual machine, it now runs Ruby much faster. So if you want to run a fast application with multi-threaded capabilities, you probably want to use JRuby. And you had a question?
Yeah, I was going to ask, so if Rubinius runs Ruby with Ruby, does it just then use whatever the other interpreter or the other like source code to run it? Like it has to roll down to something. So like what does it normally roll down to?
Yeah. So it doesn't just go in an infinite loop. And
Yeah.
It just doesn't like pass Ruby to Ruby.
Yeah.
That's a good point. The thing with that is that their interpreter is really complicated. It's got a lot of, in order to allow you to use Ruby to write an interpreter, to write Ruby, the interpreter has to do all sorts of gymnastics that are beyond me. But it does eventually compile down to, or it doesn't compile, but it does eventually get down to bytecode. So they wrote their own virtual machine, basically.
Oh, okay.
So for a developer who's writing, say, in JRuby, other than the fact they have to install a couple programs differently, is there any other, like, from what I'm working with, is there any other noticeable difference?
Syntactically, is it the same?
I would say syntactically it's the same. That's kind of the point of different implementations of Ruby. It's syntactically the same, except in a few cases where there's added functionality. Like with JRuby, it handles multiple threads. So they have to add syntax for that. And then there's also the hooking into Java, which you can do natively in JRuby, has its own syntax as well. But other than those little off the beaten track things, it's the same as Ruby. There's actually a concept called, for Ruby implementations, there's a concept called the Rails singularity, which is when that implementation of Ruby can run Rails right off the bat.
So then, sorry, as a follow-up, you said, correct me if I misunderstood you, the Java system is currently faster than the, what was Ruby originally, C+, right? Or C?
Right.
It's currently faster.
Right.
So then why wouldn't the community kind of shift to Java in general? Like, is there a reason why that would be a stronger push?
That's a good question, and I don't have the answers to that. I am tending towards developing in JRuby whenever I can, so that's just my personal choice. Yes?
Didn't you find that isn't 1.9.3 and 2.0 catching up though in terms of the Java speed? I thought it was like they're constantly trading off in terms of speed.
That's true. So basically what determines their speed is the virtual machines and like the garbage collectors behind it, which is kind of low-level stuff. But yeah, and that's a good point too. A lot of these Ruby implementations are actually behind. A lot of them are on 1.8.7. So that's another point to consider. But yeah, that is true. They have been switching off. That's true. Yes?
And so the default Ruby that you get if you just went through your basic Ruby install, that's the C1 that Mats originally wrote?
Right. That's Matz's Ruby interpreter, or MRI.
Okay.
So, if there are any more questions, you can find me afterwards, and if you want to install JRuby, come and find me.
So can you run Rails on top of any of those implementations?
The ones that have achieved Rails singularity are, I believe, MRI, JRuby, Rubinius, and I think MacRuby is getting there.
Interesting. Cool.
Cool. All right, thanks a lot for coming.
So you're trying to run the other one then?
Yeah, we're just going to create the 19 minutes on that.
I'll put some-
So were you up in Canada here recently?
Yeah, it was. That's actually how I found